So I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural Mary Baskin Waters Lecture in Women's and Gender Studies. So the United States has celebrated Women's History Month in March since 1987, and this year is the 40th anniversary of the Women's and Gender Studies program. So a historic anniversary and a historic month seems to be a very fortuitous time to start for the historic launch of a new lecture series, especially a lecture series grounded in social justice and community engagement, which were from the beginning elements central to the mission and work of the Women's and Gender Studies program. I know the program, and indeed the college, is very, very grateful to Dr. Waters for making this lecture series possible. My colleague Sally Boyd is going to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Waters and the lecture series, and then my colleague Dr. Weber will introduce the speaker. So looking forward with great interest to tonight's lecture and to the continuation of this lecture series in coming years. So welcome to this historic evening.
Good evening. I bring you greetings and regrets from Ed Madden, who's the director of the Women's and Gender Studies program. Ed is very sorry that he's not able to be here tonight, but he is in St. Louis, where he is giving a poetry reading. So I think that justifies his absence, although he regrets that he's not able to be here. He did ask me to mention briefly one of the events that's taking place as part of our anniversary celebration. On March 24th, there will be a big birthday party. The Partnership Council is sponsoring this, putting it together, and we thought about it and we decided instead of a dinner that would maybe be a little too sedate, we would prefer to just have a party. So we're going to be at Stone River. It's going to be from 6 to 9 p.m. with food, drink, musical entertainment, a silent auction, and a very special focus is our recognition of 3 social justice luminaries that we have selected because their lives and careers have been emblematic of the principles that the Women's and Gender Studies program is founded on. These 3 luminaries are Marjorie Hammock, Harriet Hancock, and Sarah Leverett. There are flyers about the event and how you can get tickets on the refreshment table, so I urge you to take a look when the program is over tonight. Now what I want to do is take you back in time a little bit. I'm at that point in my life where I can go back in time frequently. I want to take you back to, it was a sunny summer day in 1996, and Mary and I were at the peak of a mountain in the Andes. We were on a 2-week exchange program in Colombia, South America, focusing on women's grassroots economic opportunity. That afternoon, after we had lunch at Anne Marie's finca, some of us, along with our hosts, agreed to take a steep climb up to a peak from which we could look down on both sides, and it was absolutely spectacular. We were probably as breathless from the beauty as we were from the climb. It was just amazing. This trip gave me the opportunity to get to know Mary fairly well, and one of the things that struck me about her was her incredible sense of adventure. She didn't say no to anything. She was a wonderful person to travel with. I also witnessed, as we went through these 2 weeks in Colombia, her concern for the struggles that many of the people we visited were facing. The poverty, the limited opportunity. Her commitment to social justice was evident to me then, and it hasn't flagged one bit over the ensuing years. She's chosen USC's Women's and Gender Studies program as one of the pathways to make a difference. And her generosity in creating this lectureship, being inaugurated tonight, gives the program an opportunity to share experiences and insights through speakers like the one we have tonight, with both our institution and the larger community beyond. I'd like to ask Mary to stand, and I would ask you to join me in expressing our profound appreciation to Mary Baskin Waters.
In 1996, when they were up on that mountain peak, I was just coming to USC. And my first day here, first day in the office, I went over to the bookstore and I bought a bunch of memorabilia, you know, footballs and jerseys and all kinds of things for my nieces and my 7 nieces and nephews, because I'd come to USC. And then I got back to the office, and my very first appointment was with Mary Waters. And she probably doesn't remember this, but I do very well. And we were in the old house over there across from the business building. Mary was sitting on this broken down sofa that was in there, and she was telling me about what the state of life was for women in the state and at USC, and what she planned to do and what her hopes were for women at the university and in the state. And I'll never forget it. I loved her from the day one, and I said to myself, I've really come to the right place. And I called up Jean. I said, I came to the right place. You know, as a child of the 60s, I've always been driven by a desire to make a difference in my world. As this lecture demonstrates, Mary Baskin Waters continues to be a woman who is making a difference inside and outside of the academy. And that's why when Ed Madden put out a call for a recommendation for the inaugural Mary Baskin Waters lecture, I immediately thought of my longtime colleague and friend, Mary Margaret Fonow. Mary Margaret is someone I have always admired for her brilliant scholarship, intellectual integrity, and commitment to and action for social change. So I zipped an email to Ed, and I sent him links to her webpage, and within 30 minutes, Ed had zipped back, she looks awesome, she's the right one. So, and within 24 hours, we had a yes from Mary Margaret Fonow, and I'm so pleased that that's the case. It's always a challenge to straddle the boundaries of the ivory tower in our communities, to try to understand the struggles of everyday people, convey those to a wider audience, and then work with others to promote justice. I can think of no one whom I would rather hear talk about how to make a difference inside and outside of the academy than Mary Margaret, because she has done it. At Arizona State University, she's a professor of women and gender studies, and since 2009, she is the founding director of the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State. Now, I repeat, the School of Social Transformation. That is bold. Mary Margaret is an international leader in women's studies and has been active in the formation and development of the field for the past 40 years. Before going to ASU in 2005, Mary was a professor in the Department of Women's Studies at Ohio State University, where she helped to establish the PhD in Women's Studies. After going to ASU, she led the Women's Studies program there and established the PhD there as well in Women's Studies before she founded the School of Social Transformation. Mary Margaret Fonow's scholarship and leadership have focused in 3 major areas: feminist transnational labor activism, feminist methodology, transformational leadership, and embodied activism. She's published extensively on these topics, 5 books and numerous articles and presentations. She's conducted comparative research on workplace change and its impact on labor activism in the U.S., Canada, and Australia. More recently, she's analyzed the role of union feminists are playing transnationally to secure basic labor rights for women in the global economy. She investigates how union women develop a sense of themselves as transnational actors and how they build alliances and coalitions across national boundaries and between the labor movement and the women's movement. Her current research, which we will hear about tonight, focuses on embodied activism, somatic education, and mindfulness as she works to develop a new model of transformational leadership. Mary Margaret is actively engaged with students in the classroom and in helping students produce new research that is informed by an understanding of the intersection of justice, race, gender, class, and sexuality. That she contends that the School of Social Transformation is the ideal location to prepare students to make a difference in the world. For nearly 20 years at USC, I've been teaching graduate students from across the campus who take women's and gender studies classes, and one thing is always clear to me: they want to make a difference, and they want to know how to do it. Mary Margaret Fonow has been a leader in showing people interested in promoting social justice how to do it. And I know she'll lead the way for us tonight. I give you my friend, Mary Margaret Fonow.
Thank you, Lynn, for that wonderful introduction, and Mary for sponsoring the lecture, and for the audience who chose to come out to hear what I have to say. Like Lynn, I've been involved in women's studies for 40 years, and I want to talk a little bit first about how women's studies shaped my sense of leadership before I talk about some of the new work. So I hope you'll indulge me with a bit of trips down memory lane, because I'm in that age bracket now where it seems really important to explore where I came from and to acknowledge the people that have been so foundational in my own life and so foundational to forming women and gender studies, like many of you here in the audience. I went away to college in 1967 and never looked back. I've been in college continuously in some capacity for 48 years. So I love college. I'm one of those tenured radical professors that so worries the conservatives. Much of my time has been spent in large public universities where I have been involved in shaping the field of women and gender studies. I was a TA in one of the first women's studies courses in the nation at Ohio State University, and the first graduate student permitted to take a comprehensive general exam on the topic of gender. A faculty member at the first liberal arts college in the U.S. to require all students to take a course that covered gender, race, or class. The first faculty member tenured in women and gender studies at Ohio State, and eventually the founding director of the School of Social Transformation. I've been involved in curricular and program development in women's studies since its inception, and despite the many obituaries for the women's movement, I am here to tell you that feminism is alive and well inside and outside the academy. Much of what I have learned about leadership comes from these struggles, and I thank you for this opportunity to reflect upon how my work in women's studies has been transformative. The origins of my interest in what counts as, of course I knew I was going to forget how to do this. This is a photo, actually it's a famous photo there on I'm somewhere in that crowd. I was actually there. That's my campus on 1970 Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, and the speaker is a well-known photographer who was there he chronicled many of the photographs of the student movement and the civil rights movement, and he came to take pictures, but instead he got up and brought the troops together in a wonderful conversation. So the origin of my interest in what counts as education and for what purpose can be traced to my experiences as a first-generation college student on a very radical campus, Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, and I was there from 1967 to 1971. This very good public university is located in the White Appalachian region of Ohio, a rural, poor, and isolated community with a substantial black student population recruited from the urban industrial regions of the state of Ohio, mostly kids from blue-collar unionized households. When Martin Luther King was assassinated in my first year of college, 3,000 students wearing black armbands assembled on the green to both grieve and rage. We were directed to the demonstration by members of the Black Student Coalition, an organization created to demand a Black Studies curriculum, the hiring of black faculty, and an institutional response to racism on campus. The following year, when white non-academic employees went on strike, the same black activists were the first to extend solidarity and urge us not to cross the picket line at the cafeteria. I grew up in Steubenville, Ohio, a blue-collar steel town, so I knew labor politics, but I had never witnessed this type of labor-student solidarity that transcended race. The strong anti-war movement at Ohio University included returning vets from Vietnam, some from my high school, who were politicized by their tour in Vietnam. A war was raging, cities were burning, poverty was being exposed, all hell was breaking loose, and I wanted to understand why. I sought out courses on poverty, radical political thought, and black studies that could explain what was happening. There were only 2 courses I could find on women, and I took both of them, and precious few women were on the faculty. And one course I took was in the English department, taught by the architect Maya Lin's mother, Julia Lin. And Maya Lin is the architecture that designed the Vietnam Memorial. And her father was the dean of the College of Arts, and her mother taught literature. And it was Chinese women writers of the Ming Dynasty. Okay, that was like one of the courses that I took. The other course was Women and Comparative Systems of Oppression. And it was taught by Lindiwe Mabaza, a professor in exile from South Africa who taught in the Emerging Black Studies program. In this class, I learned about apartheid and the international struggles against it, and through her example, that women could be university professors. She went on to be, after she left academia, she became very active in the ANC and eventually was the ambassador to Germany from South Africa after Nelson Mandela was elected president. Her housemate at the time was Barbara Masekela, the sister of the musician Hugh Masekela, and she eventually went on to work for Nelson Mandela and is acknowledged in his autobiography, Long Road to Freedom, and she helped to organize some of his archival material and to work with the writing. Their home was a mecca for international activists from the post-colonial struggles in various parts of Africa who often visited Athens after an appearance at the UN. Equally important to my activism was the many co-curricular activities that were part of a vibrant Black studies scene in Athens. The poet Quincy Troop was an artist in residence, and under his directions, we even went door to door in the dorms collecting money to bring to campus Sun Ra's Electric Light Orchestra. For those of you who want to know what that is, I'll tell you later. But he taught 3 different, he was a creative writer, but he taught courses on the Harlem Renaissance writers and the African writers, and he actually wrote my letter to go to graduate school in sociology. So those were the days when a poet could write a letter of reference for you to go to graduate school in sociology. But it was my interdisciplinary Black Studies courses linking the concepts of power, oppression, and resistance that influenced my early work in women's studies. Because there wasn't women's studies yet, but I was steeped in Black studies, in the struggles to bring it about, in the curricular reforms, in the extracurricular activities. So my entree into women's studies was really through Black studies. So I went to graduate school just in case the revolution I was sure was imminent didn't happen. I applied to a few graduate schools as a backup strategy. Whatever made me think graduate school was the backup to revolution eludes me now. Although Ohio State was only 75 miles away from my undergraduate institution, it did not have the same type of political culture. The sociology department there did have the feminist sociologist Laurel Richardson, and I fell in love with feminism, the missing ingredient in my undergraduate education. Richardson is now well known for her visionary work in expanding sociological approaches for analyzing and representing data through poetry and narrative writing. Yet in 1971, only a handful of campuses had opportunities for students like myself to work with feminist scholars. And I was her TA in the sociology of women, and I was in every graduate seminar that she taught. It was perhaps the most important influence in my thinking about feminism and knowledge production was a sociology of gender seminar where I met my future collaborator Judith Cook in 1976, and which transformed into a feminist intellectual community that continued to meet long after the seminar ended. The group was made up of graduate students from a number of disciplines who were discovering that the master's tools could not, as they were taught to us, unlock the social realities of women. We needed to refashion old tools and invent new ones to answer our research questions. It became clear to the group that the problem was more than finding or creating the right tools to help us collect and analyze data. We needed to address larger questions about the politics of knowledge construction. Who can create knowledge? What does power circulate? How does power circulate throughout the research enterprise? What can be known? How do we validate our knowledge claims? What are the researchers' ethical obligations? How can research empower women? We realized that the epistemological questions about the nature of knowledge were inseparable from questions of methodology and how to do research. We discovered that research did not always unfold the way the methods text prescribed, and realized an acute lag between our traditional methodological training and the type of research questions we wanted to pursue. By design, the seminar was collaborative and shaped by the principles of feminist pedagogy. First, personal experience was a legitimate source of insight in both theory building and empirical research. And I had grown up in the shadow of a very large steel mill, and I wanted to study women going into this male-dominated occupation, and I was in the seminar, and I was able to present my ideas about what it would be like in a steel mill for women. So my own social location in a steel community was, valid insight into what might be researchable. Second, revisionism and innovation in theory and methods were viewed as acceptable, and the demystification of the research process was sought through candid in-class discussions of which research strategies worked and which did not. Third, a collaborative search for knowledge was encouraged through joint research projects and collective discussions of the conduct of inquiry. Since we were focusing on what actually happened in and our own reactions to the research process, we were encouraged to reveal false starts, negative feelings, unresearchable questions, refusal of entree, and other failures that were too often absent from the research accounts. For graduate students in the audience, you read finished products, but hardly anybody ever tells you all the false starts, all the problems along the way, what didn't work out. From those early discussions, Judith and I developed a 35-year collaboration and friendship. We began our publishing careers with articles about what we thought at the time characterized feminist engagement with research, culminating in the publication of Beyond Methodology, Feminist Scholarship as Lived Research, an edited collection of essays written by feminist philosophers, psychologists, sociologists, historians, and demographers. The book covers every aspect of conducting research that we thought illustrated the steps involved in doing feminist research, ranging from questions of who has the cognitive authority to know, to the value of quantitative feminist research, to the dissemination of findings. The book reached a large audience and is still in print. And again, for graduate students, this was a project that we developed in graduate school, and it has sold 10,000 copies. It was published in '91, but nothing I ever did after that ever reached this level of, fame and fortune. But it was our struggles around how to be feminist scholars in the academy, you know, when there was not like a generation or a cohort before us. And I'm proud to say that Lynn's article is in that early anthology, and she and her colleague Elizabeth Higginbottom wrote about their struggles around doing interviews with the subjects of their research. And it was deliberately focused on intersectionality, because my experiences in Black studies I brought with me into women's studies. I'm not sure I would have had the consciousness to do that if I hadn't had that undergraduate experience, which is why I'm spending time on it. After graduation, Judith and I went our separate ways. She to Chicago, where eventually landed at the University of Illinois at Chicago, which I now understand your provost is going to be their president. So she does her work on mental health disability, and much of it is quantitative, and it's oriented around evaluating services and intervention strategies for dealing with people with severe mental illness. And she tries to include, and she's working with Canadian colleagues that also work with Lynn, on how to do that from an intersectional feminist point of view. I was lucky to return to Ohio State, and a lot of times they tell you in graduate school you'll never end up back at your school, but that happened for me. So I go back to Ohio State in 1985, where I remained for the next 20 years to build academic programs and department structures for the emerging field of women's studies. And for the first 12 years, I was in an untenured academic professional type role where I did a lot of administration and a lot of program building and research and teaching, but I wasn't on a tenure track position. Ohio State is located in Columbus, Ohio, the state capital, so the opportunities for outreach were significant and varied, but perhaps the most formative was our work with the state government. During the Celeste years, 1983 to 91, Dick Celeste was I think the youngest governor ever elected. He was hired lots of young professionals in his administration, and he's sometimes, Clinton and he are sometimes compared to each other in terms of that kind of youthful, hip kind of personality, had some of the same character flaws, but I won't go into that. But during the Celeste years, women's studies had access. This is a very unusual experience. We had access to the halls of state government and to the governor's mansion. He had appointed an unprecedented number of women to leadership roles in his administration, and I, an untenured, you know, trying to figure out how I could make a job for myself, I led a policy seminar for these women in state government. He had put together a women's leadership council. And then women's studies faculty that I organized began to win funding for policy-related research in women's health, sexual harassment, domestic violence, rape education, and prevention. The Commission on the Status of Women, and I know Mary was involved in the similar one here, the Commission on the Status of Women in Ohio was vibrant and effective and created many new programs for women throughout the state, particularly in rural areas. The Women's Studies program, if you can believe this, held fundraisers in the governor's mansion, and we participated in a conference for governors' spouses organized by Dagmar Celeste, a feminist and strong supporter of women's studies. Their daughter-in-law earned her MA degree in women's studies program. We never did raise much money, nor did I ever see the inside of the governor's conference room once he was out of office and there was a succession of Republicans who didn't pursue the same relationship that he had pursued with women's studies. They also disbanded the Commission on the Status of Women and rescinded money I had been awarded to study sexual harassment in state government. Our foray into politics ended abruptly, and we turned our energies to building a Department of Women's Studies with tenure lines and creating a PhD program. And so every spot along the way, I'm like creating jobs for myself, you know, and gaining leadership skills and resourcefulness skills. I don't know what they're called, but, you know, women's studies was the most resourceful place I ever encountered, and I had to learn how to do that because we became a department during a period when there was downsizing, so it's rather late in the game to be doing that. And then I was the first to be hired in the new lines that had been allocated, and I earned tenure. I was the first tenured person in a line in women's studies in 2002. Through activism and resourcefulness and the help of a village of progressive-minded colleagues and community activists, I managed to carve out a professional life in academia. Along the way, I was sustained by the students I taught and by the activism of the women steelworkers I studied and wrote about in a book that I published called Union Women, Forging Feminism in the United Steelworkers of America. And people will go, feminism, steelworkers, you can't put those two things together. And then people would say, I thought labor was dead. I thought the women's movement was dead. And here I discover these very courageous women carving out, making their union more responsive to their issues as women in a male-dominated structure. These women had courage and grit, and they inspired me to stay the course in academia. And boy, could they work hard. So they were an inspiration for me. I did research with this population in the 70s. I went to a steelworkers convention of like 3,000 people. There were 7 women. They met in someone's hotel room, drew up a list of demands, and ran to the podium. But of course, their demands were never read from the podium. And 20 years later, they have an international women's conference, and there's like 800 women delegates there, and they have a leadership program and an office and many activities around the promotion of women's rights. But that took 25 years. So, change is slow, but steady if you're persistent. In 2004, I left Ohio State for Arizona State to direct the Women and Gender Studies program and to establish a PhD program in gender studies. And while it is relatively new, established in 2009, the PhD has already attracted students from India, China, Pakistan, Uganda, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Tajikistan. I was recruited to ASU as part of a radical experiment to reinvent higher education through the creation of new transdisciplinary schools that would break down the silos of the disciplines and address compelling research questions. The president, Michael Crow, had come up with these design imperatives that he thought the new universities should be paying attention to. And they included things like conducting use-inspired research, being socially embedded, leveraging place, being inclusive, global outreach. And so when I saw those, I thought, he's stolen the women's studies playbook. This is what we've been about, all these, this is the place for me. So I wanted to experiment with new ways of doing higher education, but I underestimated the enthusiasm the insiders would have for external change agents. So I was all ready to roll up my sleeves and create the new American University, and they were going, oh, wait. So when I arrived, the faculty morale was low, and when I asked how could I improve things, a senior faculty member in women's studies told me not to act so happy to be there. So then I thought, well, maybe it's the sunshine, because Columbus, Ohio was gloomy, and here I was in the Southwest, and after about 5 weeks, I was grinning ear to ear every day, up and eager, and I was like, what is going on here, So, but I stayed the course because I knew change is hard, and in 2009, I was named the founding director of the School of Social Transformation. And ASU had already been organizing into transdisciplinary schools, but by the time 2009 comes around, everybody else was told get in schools because of the economic restructuring that was happening all across the nation. But the departments and programs that came together in the School of Social Transformation already were working well together, so that's a part of the success of the reorganization. And it included women and gender studies, African and African American studies, Asian Pacific American studies, and justice studies. And then a few years after that, a group of scholars who do equity research in education joined our school and brought the Center for Indian Education with them. So this is a very multicultural, intersectional space of people who are committed to social justice and social change. So we already have some things going for us. But a friend of mine used to tell me this joke about how many academics does it take to change a light bulb? Change? Okay, so like everybody was so wedded into their particular agenda, it was really hard to get them to think about new activities and new ways to generate collaboration. But I had been studying social movements and alliance building all of my life, and organized labor has to bring together people across a lot of differences. And so like I had a few tricks up my sleeve, and I had a very progressive dean, and she gave me some resources to make this sort of cooperative spirit. And so she gave me a faculty line, and we recruited a young scholar. We made a job ad for somebody to come to the School of Social Transformation. Over 250 young scholars applied for that position. We didn't even know what the School of Social Transformation was. And they were writing these big, long letters of inquiry telling us basically what it was. And we were like, that's cool, we'll borrow that, we'll take that. You know, and we did hire a young scholar, Wendy Chang, who had been doing a postdoc at NYU in the only other place that's similarly organized. It's called the Social and Cultural Analysis there. But it had some of the same players, and so she sort of knew and got it, and she's going up for tenure next year. So, and then we had seed grants that brought faculty together around projects and activities, research projects. We did a symposium on girls and sexuality and how media represents these issues, and that group produced a volume of, an edited volume of articles from that. Another group did work around domestic violence, and they published a special issue of a criminology journal on domestic violence. So it did, every project had to have at least 3 people from these programs, so that in order to get the money, they had to do that. So we built some structural things in. But it was really tough going, and I was just turned 60 at the time, or close to that. And, you know, first when I was sort of reluctant to take on the task, but I was persuaded to do that. So no matter, like, as soon as I started realizing how difficult it was going to get, I quickly developed sciatica pain. I don't know if anybody in here has ever had sciatica. I thought, holy cow, what is this? And so I went through all the regular medicine, the alternative medicine, looking for a solution, but my body just was telling me it wasn't ready for this work. I wasn't afraid of change, and I thought women's studies would be better served by being a part of a school that included the study of race, class, and justice. All of my commitments in one place. Even my mom said, "This is you all over." My background in labor studies and black studies helped me intellectually and politically to forge a common ground, but I was not prepared for the emotional and physical pain such change would generate. I needed help and found it in the most unusual place. I met and worked with a Feldenkrais practitioner to alleviate the sciatica pain, but along the way discovered that leadership did not have to hurt. Once the pain was gone, I wanted to understand the somatic side of leadership and began new work on transformational leadership and embodied activism. And this colleague of mine teaches this method in our dance department. But he and I are now teaching a course together that I'm going to talk a little bit about on social transformational leadership. So then, this was just my slide I was supposed to show you before about women's studies producing leaders. And after Obama was elected to president, the National Women's Studies Association got a call from the White House asking could some leaders from women's studies come to the White House and talk to the Council on Women and Girls that Obama had just formed. And so I was one of 12 people that was invited to go. And when I got there, we went into, he wasn't there, but the council women were there, and the bringing around the room were a lot of young recent college graduates or interns at the White House. And the whole thing came about because these were women's studies majors or minors or certificate students, and they were doing these internships in the White House and in the various agencies in government. And one of them had been working with Michelle and told Michelle, you need to hear what women's studies has to say. And so these young women, they produced out of women's studies programs, were bringing their professors together, and we were like their rock stars, you know. It was like really amazing. Of course, you could only go one time, otherwise you'd be an interest group. So nothing ever, you know, I don't know what came out of it, but anyway, that was our trip to the White House. So this was just my way of thinking about a variety of ways to think about students. They're producers of knowledge, scholars, creators, researchers, performers, designers. That was just a reminder of students have had as big an impact on me as I have had on them. I mean, my struggles to explain what we're about. So a lot of people want to go, social transformation, you know, what do you mean by that? Okay, so I've had to give talks and speeches and write things, and I'm always looking for new ways to describe it. But there is research scholarship around something called transformational leadership. So I want to talk a little bit about what transformation means before I go to the leadership part. So it's a term often borrowed from the arts. Okay, so transformation is a change in the shape, structure, the nature of something. In art, the term form, it's probably, I don't know if you can read it, but in art, the term form is usually used to consider the shape, style, or methods of creative work or endeavor. So how something is expressed, including the materials, the components of principles of designs, whereas the content relates to underlying influences, meanings, and interpretation. So transform is transforming the structure that influences the content influences the structure of something. So it implies that something is qualitatively different. Could be for the better or the worst. It's usually we think of it in social justice terms as transforming something for the better. And it unfolds in unpredictable ways. It's not always a clear path or logic. It's ambiguous. You don't always know when you're in the middle of change making whether change is being made or not. And so you have to have they have to have the capacity to believe, you know, that you're making something better for the future, or the capacity to understand when you've made a mistake and need to change courses, and how to be more flexible, how to be more forgiving, more understanding, more patient. Okay, so over these many years and in the process of trying to form the School of Social Transformation, I realized that I needed new ways to think about leadership if I wanted to be healthy about it. These are the dimensions of what the scholars consider transformational leadership. Embodiment is a piece of it. Transformation is experienced and realized through the body. Obviously, my sciatica pain in the end, when I was able to release the tension I was carrying in my body, was telling me something about I was white-knuckling a lot of things, not, realizing the toll it was taking on my body. Obviously, we speak to people with gestures and movements, and we are in our bodies when we are with people. Emotions are a part of transformational leadership. Moods, feelings. Emotions are highly relevant for any kind of transformation. And in order to create the disposition for change, you have to acknowledge that, recognize that, sort of mobilize the emotions. And then there's an aesthetic dimension to transformational leadership because you're imagining a different outcome, a future that you're not entirely sure what it's going to be. You have to improvise. You have to use symbols. Style is a part of being a transformational leadership. So in my course, I have students even reading articles about, can leadership be beautiful? And what would it mean to lead beautifully? This is just a model. I'm going to talk about each of these dimensions of transformational leadership. The components. Part of it is envisioning you know, offering some alternative ways of thinking about things, being able to describe through vivid imagery and exciting words, you know, the possibilities to imagine how what we're learning in our fields of women's studies, black studies, ethnic studies, justice studies, how do we operationalize those concepts and those ideas in ways that people can hear, that are connecting to their sense of who they are and their sense of justice. Obviously, transformational leadership requires a certain amount of inspiration, motivation, you know, recognizing that you're in it together. Usually there's not a strong demarcation between leaders and followers. It's more the collective interaction, and realizing that there's a lot of creative qualities that come from intrinsic motivation, that people are intrinsically motivated for a social change, and that you can tap into that in very creative ways. Stimulating ideas, and that's what I think we're really in the forefront in women's studies. A lot of our ideas about ways of solving problems are, even though for those of us who've been steeped in it for 40 years, you probably realize it's not that way. When we went to this meeting at the White House and tried to explain intersectionality, they just couldn't get it. And then somebody says, well, simultaneously a woman might also be from the working class and a person of color. And they go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. We get that. But they just couldn't. And then transnational was the same way. And then I had to say, well, comparing women in different parts of the world. And they go, oh, yeah. So we have language and ideas that aren't always translatable. So part of this is finding those creative ways of doing that. And then something that's sometimes hard for those of us who've been involved in movements is to consider the individual. And I have sort of come full circle on this because individuals have, now that I'm in a position where I have to, I hate to use this word because I'm coming from labor, manage, but I don't know another word to use it, but I've got 50 faculty members, 150 graduate students, about 1,000 students majoring, and I have to, a staff of 16, I have to be able to get work done. And some that requires listening to individuals, treating them as individuals, understanding what they bring to the table, what they might need. The same solution doesn't work for the entire group. You want to be fair and equitable, but you also have to understand that not only are there unique qualities to the people, but they have distinct situations. And you can't just put together these 5 programs that have unique histories and backgrounds and motivations and say now everybody gets the same thing, we're all the same, we're all into this together, because they speak to different constituencies, they have different histories, they don't experience the academy in the same way. So they have distinct situations that have to be taken into account. New forms of leadership, I've read a lot of the stuff coming out of Silicon Valley, and a lot of it is about empathy, active listening skills, how to have more open communication, spontaneity, and mindfulness. There's mindfulness everywhere these days. I was eating breakfast in Einstein's coffee shop on campus, and the napkin dispenser had the word mindful on it, and it was about recycling the paper. So, like, it's everywhere, right? So I have been working with this notion of embodied leadership, and there are institutes now about embodied leadership, and they're training people from the nonprofit sector, from the social movement sector, and from like progressive corporations. There's an organization in California working with the domestic workers, have been organizing for labor rights, and they've been doing a lot with this form of somatic education. So this is just a quote that I like that says, we don't need leaders who know about leadership. We need leaders who embody the capacity to lead in the midst of ambiguity and complexity. The concept of embodied leadership is derived from somatic coaching, a unique approach that brings the body forward as an advocate in creating a place for change and transformation. It brings together language, action, feeling, and meaning, and is based on the idea that the mind and the body are inextricably linked. To develop one, you must cultivate the other. And of course, in academia, everybody's head floats around and the body is somewhere else. It's like really hard to catch up. And I was one of those people that walked across campus like there was something really important on the ground. And a friend of mine said she just thought that, I was deep in thought, and it was just like my body was falling over, it was like tense. Okay, so I started looking for new ways to think about leadership and new ways to teach about it and new ways to lead myself. And then I discovered this new association that's called the Association for the Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. And it's 5 years old. They have a website you can go to. They now have a journal called the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry. And their faculty and people, advisors and creative writing centers and a wide variety of people in different types of universities and colleges. It started in Amherst College, but it's also at the University of Virginia, Brown, University of Washington, and even at my school, we're having conversations about creating an initiative, a university-wide initiative that would be around mindfulness and empathy. And my leadership piece would be a part of it, but it's being done in nursing, business, social work, engineering. A lot of different fields are taking up these contemplative practices as a way of calming the mind, of helping people be more embodied and more present. So presence is a big part of transformational leadership. And so how can you be present if you're constantly triggered by everybody else's madness? Okay, so you have to have some contemplative practice. And they have grants, and they do a conference, and I've been a couple times. This is it's a reproduction from a new anthology that came out. But contemplative practices, because some of this they're done in religion programs, in philosophy programs, but they're also done in very secular settings. And so, it's a combination of visualizations, journaling, art, dance, movement, meditation. It can be any one of these things. And it's sort of individuals can choose any sort of branch that they want to. Yoga practitioners, martial artists, artists, creative writers are all turning to these contemplative practices. Now, the one that I've been doing, because it worked for me and it's offered on my campus and I became interested in it, is called Feldenkrais. Has anybody heard of that? Has anybody ever heard of that? Some of you have. I wondered if you could indulge me by standing up. I'm going to do a little demonstration of what Feldenkrais is. Okay, so if you stand up and keep your feet about hip width apart, and then to begin with, put your hand out in front of yourself, okay, and move to the right as comfortably as you can. Don't go any further than is comfortable. Okay, then bring it back. Okay, set it down. Okay. Now, I'm not a practitioner, so this is just going to be a tiny little taste of what it is. So okay, so put your hand again in front. Okay, and move it to the right a little bit and come back. Move it a little bit further and come back. Follow with your head and eyes. Move a little bit further. Don't go any further than is comfortable. Do it many times. Small gentle movements. To the right. Follow with your head and your eyes. Okay, put your hand down. Rest. You have to have a little rest because your brain is taking in some information, new information. Okay, now this time raise your hand. Move your hand and your head to the right, but your eyes to the left. As gentle as you can. Oh, Lord. Did anybody experience it differently from the beginning to the end? Did anybody have a different, was it easier, harder?
Went further.
Went further, okay. So almost every movement that you do, you're always a lot taller than you think you are. And the range of motion that the Feldenkrais, this is called awareness through movement, and it's done by musicians and singers and dancers. Athletes do it. The practitioner that I work with at my university does our football team in the summer. Okay, and a lot of it's offered in the dance department, but musicians who do a lot of repetitive hand motion become tense, habituated in certain movements, and turned off by their their course of study, and so they're not as creative and energized as they would be if they could find alternative ways of moving. So the Feldenkrais is really trying to find different ways. Eventually, the plasticity of the brain, you're creating more neural pathways for movement. And so it's not like you're consciously thinking about moving differently, it's just that over time you get a better, more efficient way of moving, which then reduces the stress and the pain, and that's why the sciatica pain went away. I still have a compressed disc, but I don't have the sciatica pain anymore because I was holding myself in a way that was doing this to me. Now, the research about Feldenkrais is mostly done with people with traumatic brain injuries or stroke. A lot of people who work with stroke patients. Feldenkrais is done, it was developed by Moshe Feldenkrais, that's the man that invented it. But in Australia, UK, Canada, oftentimes physical therapists have Feldenkrais practitioners in their clinics so that it's more widely known in other parts of the world than it is here. But it was a part of the human potential movement of the 70s. Practitioners all across the U.S. were trained in it. If you're familiar with the book, The Brain That Changes Itself, there's references. The new book that the Deutsch, as his name, wrote is called The Brain That Heals Itself, and he has a whole chapter on Moshe. You can put it in the internet and find examples of more lessons. In fact, like now, if I had, from the constantly using the computer and stuff, I'll just put in Feldenkrais and wrist, and I'll get a lesson, and then I can do a lesson, and then because I've done so much of the work, it has a great effect. So what we started to do, Rich and I, was to teach this course in social transformation, and it brings in students from across all of our programs and students from, we have a School of Sustainability and the Herberger Institute for the Arts. So these are our primary, we've taught it 3 times, it's at the graduate level. And we do Feldenkrais awareness through movement lesson. We do insight meditation, which is a particular type of meditation, and then we read and discuss articles. So the meditations are either sitting or walking, and the Feldenkrais lessons that Rich designs fit in with, they help you breathe, they help you sit, they help you walk in the meditation. So there's a connection between the two. And then we read a lot of articles that are about different ways of implementing somatic practices into leadership. This is one of my favorite cartoons, where the human being mind is always full, and the dog is really seeing the trees and the sun that's there. So a lot of this work is about quieting the mind so you can be more present, you can be less triggered by the past, less triggered by fantasizing and catastrophizing about the future. And the students, the reason I wanted to try this, and the students keep journals, and they write a lot in their journals before and after each class. They write about what life is like. A lot of them are teaching assistants, and they teach about topics that are really contentious and difficult to teach about. Poverty and homophobia and sexism and racism. And they themselves are gay or person of color or all of the identities that we embody in our learning. So they're not like neutral in the classroom. Their bodies are there in the classroom, hearing
difficult things from students who some of whom don't know any better. And so, like, education is about creating the space where people can have the discussions and hear the ideas and grapple with them. And you're not in a position to do that if you can't create some space in yourself to be present and to help students work through the material and the discussions. But then many of our graduate students, we have 2 PhD programs and 3 master's programs. Many of them are working in shelters for domestic violence shelters, or they're working in the juvenile justice system, or they're working in labor rights centers or poverty centers, or they all want to make a difference. They're all, they're doing internships in over 150 agencies in the Phoenix area. And they're discovering life is pretty hard. And we have given them lots of book knowledge, but we haven't really done the kind of training that I think now they might need to have in order to be more effective in the world as change agents. So we're just trying to develop these capacities in students, and we started a series of studies where we're trying to measure mindfulness from a quantitative point of view, and body awareness and ethical leadership capacities. So, these are we're trying to understand whether or not these techniques can help them be more present, more able to take the role of another, able to listen. We have I can show you the questionnaire if you want to see. There are measures of mindfulness. I went to the National Institute of Health and got whatever I could get. And we're showing that the Feldenkrais part of it is increasing their capacity to be more mindful. And to be less triggered in difficult conversations. But it's just unfolding. We hope that this institute that we eventually get to create at ASU will allow us to do more transdisciplinary research. There would be a cognitive psychologist and the dean of our nursing school was the lead on this. And so and of course, I believe now that I'm on the other side of the administrative table, the faculty themselves would be better served if they could be a little bit more mindful. And some of the faculty are starting to hang out in the course. So we're creating those. A lot of people are skeptical. But, I have decided this is how I'm going to use the last few years of my time in academia before I retire, is to try to make this translation. Because justice work is important, and people get burned out doing it. And it might be something that we can do for ourselves and for the other people in our environment. So that's it. If you have questions.
Afterwards, if we could take a couple of questions now, would you be willing?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, questions or comments?
You have a great sense of humor.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. A lot of points really
I don't have like answers, but for those of us here who've been around doing this for 40 years, okay, it's going to take a long time. So you might as well take care of yourself a bit. I had my students in this graduate seminar. It was like there's a new study out of Berkeley that shows phenomenal high rates of depression among graduate students. And so we read that article, and I think a lot of faculty may or may not, some of you might know, you're nodding your head, but a lot of students will, the faculty are focused in on research and ideas, and they may not be aware of the stressors that graduate students are under, or they take the attitude like, I did it, and I got through it, and it's supposed to be tough. And if you've seen Whiplash, anybody seen that movie, Whiplash? So that reminded me a little bit of graduate school, right? But I spent a lot of time talking about my experiences in graduate school because I would have dropped out if I had a Whiplash person, So I was, part of that was lucky, but I wanted to be in a space in the academy that will create opportunities for students to collaborate. So you have to cooperate with each other, take care of each other, acknowledge that it's tough, And when you don't understand something, to say, could we go over that again? Or, like a lot of graduate students and faculty are just as guilty of this. We're afraid to admit what we don't know because we're in an environment that you get all the rewards of showing how smart you are. Okay, so like if you're even tentatively unsure, you're not going to reveal that. You're going to like pretend you know, and then that's another more stress, right? So it's like you're, so it's for the long haul. You can't do everything at once. If you're writing a dissertation, put your energies there. Have a writing group, share the ideas with each other. You have to be, willing to hear what other people say about your work. But if you are able to detach a little bit, you might be more open to hearing suggestions and ideas than if you're fear-based. And then I have no idea, women's studies has taught thousands of students across the United States in every region. People look at me and say, School of Social Transformation in Arizona, because everybody else hears about how horrible the politics are in Arizona. But we're teaching 12,000 students a year in the courses that we offer in the School of Social Transformation. And the Dean of Undergraduate Studies says the School of Social Transformation is turning the state of Arizona purple. But we have no idea what students do with the information, like a book they read, an article they read, a reflection they write. We just really don't know. They're out in the world influenced by these ideas. But if we didn't have women's studies, if we didn't have African American studies, and we're starting a new certificate on disability studies. So if we don't create these spaces that protects the ideas and the capacity to talk about them, like where would we be? So this is my change work, is inside the academy. And then I because I do research in organized labor, I've worked some with women's